All right, welcome to episode 44 of Seize the Moment podcast. And today we have a very special guest. His name is Daniel Kaufman. And Daniel Kaufman got his BA in History and Philosophy at the University of Michigan and his Ph.D. in Philosophy at the CUNY Graduate Center. He's professor of philosophy at Missouri State University, and his main areas of interest are aesthetics, epistemology, metaphysics, and the philosophy of language. He's also one of the authors and editors of How to Live a Good Life. And today we're going to discuss Aristotelianism. Oh, and also before we do, he's also the host of the Sophia program on meaningoflife.tv. Welcome, Daniel.
Hey, Dan.
Nice to be here.
Hey, thank you so much for coming on, man. And so the first thing that we're going to ask you about is, of course, obviously Aristotle. So what did the good life look like to him? And how did he conceptualize what it meant to live a flourishing life?
So the relevant word that you find in ancient Greek philosophy to describe what Aristotle is talking about in his main work on ethics, called the Nicomachean Ethics, is eudaimonia. And eudaimonia doesn't have a straight literal English translation. It is often translated as happiness, but this can be very misleading given the modern connotation of that word in English, which is sort of like a good feeling or something of that sort. A better translation is human flourishing or human excellence. And Aristotle's, like I said, main work, the Nicomachean Ethics, is devoted to trying to understand what constitutes human flourishing, what it is to flourish as a human being. And it is worth just saying one thing about what he means by that, because the concept is a little alien in the modern frame of reference. We normally think of ourselves as individuals having various purposes, right, in life. So if someone asked you, what was your purpose in life? The answer would be specific to you, and it would be a function of your beliefs, your interests, the things you care about, and so on and so forth. That would then determine what your personal ends are, and therefore what sorts of endeavors you engage in and activities you pursue. The ancient Greeks thought they didn't think that there wasn't a personal notion of purpose, but they also thought that things just had purposes generally, right? That purpose was an objective feature of the world. So when Aristotle talks about the human purpose, he doesn't just mean your individual interests and aims. He thinks that human beings, as human beings, have purpose, have distinctive functions. And therefore, when we talk about human flourishing, he's talking about excellence with respect to those. Now, your personal aims may come into that, right? But when Aristotle asks, what is it for a human being to flourish, what he means is something analogous to if you and I were to talk about what it would mean for our gardens to flourish, right? There is what we take to be and understand as the well-being state of a garden, right? And Aristotle thinks that and that's not determined privately by people. That's just a function of the nature of gardens, right? And Aristotle thinks the same thing about people. And I could go into a lot more detail about why. I mean, this has to do with the scientific outlook of the ancient world as opposed to the modern world. This is prior to the scientific revolution. If you're interested in all that, I can get into it, but it's really not necessary to understand the concept. All that you need to know is that for Aristotle, beyond our individual purposes, human beings, qua human beings, have a distinctive purpose.
Yeah, for example, with the garden example, a flower, its own flourishing isn't dependent on how well just it is taken care of. It's how well the plants around it are taken care of as well, right? Right,
and there is such a thing for a plant to do well and not to do well that isn't a matter of anybody's subjective preferences, right? Suppose that I like my gardens wilted and dying, right? Nonetheless, there is an objective sense in which my garden is not flourishing, right? Because there is what we take to be an objective healthy state of flowers and plants, right? And that's sort of the sense in which Aristotle's conception of flourishing is objective as well. There is a objective state of well-being for people. So if you're a person who has a morbid personal desire to fail, right? If you succeed in doing that, you might be fulfilling your own personal purpose, but you're failing to fulfill the human purpose as far as Aristotle is concerned.
That's so interesting. And so the human purpose, which virtues is it comprised of?
So the way that Aristotle determines what constitutes the human purpose is by looking at what he takes to be the distinctive human characteristics, right? So look, we do share some things with our gardens. That is, we're both alive, right? But while it's sufficient for a garden to flourish merely to live, it's not sufficient for a human being to flourish merely to live, because human beings have capacities beyond the ability to live. Now, Aristotle believes that ultimately what's distinctive about human beings is our capacity for both what I'm going to call deliberative reason and what I'll call contemplative reason. But don't take the word contemplative in the modern sense of sort of navel gazing. By contemplative reason, he means the kind of reason that we employ in the pursuit of knowledge. And by deliberative reason, he means the kind of reason that we pursue for the purpose of engaging in action. Right.
So it's like the distinction is more sort of seemingly theoretical from practical.
Exactly. Okay. If you want to call it theoretical and practical reason, those are perfectly apt descriptors, right? And so Aristotle thinks that's what's distinctive about us. What's distinctive about us that no other creature or living thing shares are those two capacities. And because of that, it's all the activities that flow from those capacities that constitute human flourishing, right? And think about what those activities are. The pursuit of knowledge, right, and understanding, which includes all the sciences, includes philosophy, and all manner of scholarship. It includes ethical life, right? Deliberative reason is the chief faculty involved in ethical life, or at least one of the chief faculties involved in ethical life. Political life, and arts and craftsmanship, right? All of these activities require and employ either deliberative or contemplative or some combination of the two reason, and thus it's in exercising those and in excelling in the activities that flow from them that constitute human flourishing for Aristotle. But if you've paid notice, that means you can flourish in a lot of ways, right? There's not just one path. And one of the things, now to get argumentative, one of the reasons why I prefer, I'm assuming you read the whole book, one of the reasons I prefer the Aristotelian version of eudaimonia to the Stoic one that Massimo prefers is that for the Stoic, there's only one form of flourishing, and that's virtue. Right. Yep. For Aristotle, flourishing is multifaceted, and that's because the distinctive human capacities are multifaceted. Right? And so, in my view, Aristotle gives us a much richer, more robust, and in my view, more realistic picture of human flourishing than those that try to narrow flourishing down to a single end, to a single form of life.
And Dan, so I actually wanted to ask you about that. So, from my kind of understanding of Stoic philosophy is that, and from my reading of Massimo's chapter in the book, as well as kind of other things he's written, so the way I kind of saw it was that what he was saying is that's the good enough life. So if you're living virtuously, that's a good way for you to feel, kind of a solid sense of self-esteem or self-worth. So, but he was also saying that it's obviously quite possible to feel better, right? In the sense of like having material wealth, in the sense of having status, prestige, etc. So my kind of understanding was that it wasn't really so much all or nothing, that he wasn't saying that this is only good and the rest of it was kind of like bad or shit or whatever. The way I kind of understood Stoic philosophy is that this is just good enough and that things can get better. So if we were to kind of conceptualize success, one could, I guess, in terms of Stoic philosophy, can say I feel good enough in knowing that I tried my best, but I can certainly feel better in knowing that I was actually practically and physically successful. Right.
But let's disambiguate a few things. So first of all, let's distinguish the way you feel about your life from whether your life actually is one of flourishing or not, because that's exactly the distinction I was trying to evoke, right? I would not want to deny that Stoicism may be a very effective method of consolation, right? But that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about a theory of flourishing, right? An account of flourishing. And I've actually said this to Massimo before. I've said this to him both in print and orally, and that is that I actually would accept something like Stoicism as an account of human consolation, that is of a discipline by which we can ensure, or at least better ensure, that we're going to be satisfied with our lives, right?
Right.
But that's a distinct question from whether our lives actually were well led, right? Mm-hmm. That's that difference between the garden you want and what constitutes a healthy or flourishing garden, right? Again, if I want a dead, dying, wretched, miserable garden, there's still nonetheless a sense in which my garden is a failure, right? In which it hasn't flourished, because
right.
there's what we take to be a well-being state for plants that's distinctive from my personal desires,
right.
And the same is true for life. But let me now concede something, and that is that look, it may be, and Massimo and I have debated this. If you're interested in this, we have lengthy dialogues on the Blogging Head show, that the Meaning of Life show that I host, where we sort of debated this in quite close detail, mm-hmm. as well as we did dueling essays in the magazine that I published called the Electric Agora, which you can, if you have links in this, you can link to.
Absolutely.
It may be that the difference between the Stoic and the Aristotelian is just where they carve, the way they carve things up, rather than the entire picture. So, right. You're quite right to say that for the Stoic, the life of virtue is sufficient to have had a life worth living, right? But we would prefer a life full of what he calls preferred indifference. So these are things that are desirable, but which don't in any way impact our virtue, and thus whether or not our life was worth living, right? In a sense, then, so long, and if you look at what the Stoic says about the life of virtue, it's all about the effort and the intent that one puts into it, right? In my view, one consequence of this, however, and I think it's a counterintuitive one, and it's one of the reasons that I didn't go in the direction Massimo went. In a sense, if you really try, you can't fail on the Stoic view, right? And I just don't find it plausible to suggest that a human life can't be a failure regardless of one's best effort. In other words, I don't accept that what he calls preferred indifference are indifference. Mm-hmm. I do think that due to circumstances beyond your control, due to situations, due to just a bad hand dealt at birth, right. due to all sorts of things, one can fail to flourish, like the garden can fail to flourish, despite one's best efforts. Yep. Mm-hmm. That is, I do think that there is an element of externality. And now, Massimo doesn't necessarily disagree, and what he wants to say is that, look, what the Stoic is interested in is not really in flourishing per se, but in living a life worth living. Whereas the Aristotelian says, yeah, but the life worth living is the life of flourishing, right? And that's where they sort of come apart, right? And so I want to say that the life worth living is the life of flourishing, and that one can fail at it, yeah. right? Even if one did nothing wrong. And part of the reason I like that view is because it strikes me as true to actual life.
Mm-hmm. And Dan, what is preferred indifference?
So for Massimo, preferred indifference are things like wealth,
mm-hmm.
education, even political liberty. Mm-hmm. Like the whole point of Stoicism, I mean, look, one of the greatest Stoic authors, Epictetus, was a slave, right? Mm-hmm. Right. The whole point of Stoicism is that you can have eudaimonia even if you are enslaved, right? Mm-hmm. You can have eudaimonia even if you're sitting in Auschwitz, right? Mm-hmm. And to my view, while I don't deny that one can be consoled in such contexts, I don't think that one can flourish in such contexts. And I do think, I mean, not necessarily. Such contexts may make it impossible for one to flourish. Yeah. And I want that to be a possibility. I think that a philosophy of life in which there's no possibility of failure mm-hmm. is, in my view, deeply unrealistic. Right. And to my view, is borders on a form of self-deception.
Hmm.
Now, for Massimo, and I've said this, Dan, this is not like a secret. I mean, he knows I think this.
Yeah.
For Massimo, I don't know exactly whether it's that he disagrees with that or that he carves things up differently, where he agrees with it to the extent he says that, look, yes, that's true. You can fail to flourish despite your best efforts, but what matters isn't flourishing. What matters is being virtuous, right?
I mean, go ahead.
Sorry. So two things. One, so it seems to me that flourishing can be determined not subjectively but objectively.
For Aristotle, yes.
Right. Yeah. And then I'm wondering at the same time, wouldn't it be interesting to kind of integrate both philosophies?
That's what I was thinking too.
Or should it be that it's one or the other?
Yeah, look, I think you can be an Aristotelian and adopt basically a Stoic view of consolation. That is sort of, and what I'm saying by consolation means the ability to feel satisfied with one's self and one's life, right? But notice that's a subjective state, right? Yeah. I'm not saying it's not important. Right. But it's a distinct question from, again, whether your garden grew well or not. Right?
That makes sense.
Whether you're satisfied with it, if you believe that there's such a thing objectively as gardens growing well, whether you're satisfied with the garden is a separate issue. Yeah. It may be related. Now, in the case of Aristotle, they're integrated, right? One is only rightly satisfied if one has objectively flourished. Right. Now, to my mind, to be satisfied in the face of having failed to flourish might be a form of self-deception, or it might be a form of healthy, resigned consolation, right? Well, at least I did my best, right? But what I don't want to accept is the idea that it doesn't matter whether you flourished or not.
Right. And I'm not sure that Stoicism was saying that.
I'm not sure either. The problem with me is that I find Stoicism a little bit slippery.
I hear you. Yeah. So, I mean, my thinking of it is this, like, I wonder if we could sort of have a gradation or sort of have levels of success where we can say, I can feel pride in myself for the attempt and I can feel pride in myself for doing as much as I could, but then I can also feel even more pride if, let's say, I were to succeed. Whereas we're not particularly devaluing any form of success. We're just saying that one is just better than the other. Where it's like we have the bigger picture of obviously, kind of attempt and of actual success where we can say that's phenomenal, that's the goal. Yeah. But then we can say it's not so black and white where it's either we fail and we feel like shit, or we succeed and we feel great.
Well, but there's an in-between, though, there, and I want to just be careful with, because, I mean, the way you're putting this now sort of clarifies it to me. What I really do think I have a substantial disagreement with Massimo and with the Stoic, and that is, look, Massimo uses a lot of examples in his book, How to Be a Stoic, which came out before this one and partly served as the inspiration to do this one. Gives the example of shooting at archery, right? Right. And he says, hitting the target is a preferred indifferent.
Right.
And whether you hit the target is in part due to things you don't control. The wind, the quality of the bow you're given, all sorts of stuff like that, right? Luck. Mm-hmm. What matters is that you did your best, right? My problem with this is that one engages in archery not to try to hit targets, but to hit targets. And to downplay the idea that the failure to hit the target is a failure strikes me as either it's, again, counterintuitive or it's a form of self-deception. Yeah. But more than that, to be entirely satisfied with one's effort upon failing to do what the effort was for also strikes me as a bit... right, as a bit self-deceiving, right? The reason I engaged in the activity was to hit targets. I didn't engage in the activity to try to hit targets. So I should be unsatisfied at failing to hit the target. Now, that doesn't mean I have to hate myself, right?
Right.
But to suggest that, let's now generalize, okay? Now, let's now go to eudaimonia. Right. The equivalent to trying to hit the target is all of your life's endeavors, right? I'm trying to have good relationships. I'm trying to raise a daughter properly. I'm trying to succeed in my profession. I'm trying to have a positive impact on public discourse. All these sorts of things, right? Mm-hmm. What I'm saying is that whether my life was worth living does depend in part on whether I succeed in those things at all.
Yes.
It's very odd to say my life was worth living despite the fact that I failed at all of the things I tried to do because I was a good guy, right? Mm-hmm. Now, in my view, that's a kind of self-deception, right? Now, I do, however, think that the Stoic attitude is a good discipline, and by discipline I mean in the sense of a psychological discipline, right? Mm-hmm. For consolation in the face of failure, right? In other words, it's the sort of thing that a therapist would tell you. Okay,
it's just true. Yeah.
You know, and listen, I'm at a point in my life now in middle age where I'm starting to see which of my endeavors are going to succeed and which are going to not, probably not, right?
Right.
I'm at a point, I'm at the point now where I'm starting to see what kind of kid my daughter's going to turn out to be and so on and so forth. Or what kind of grown up my daughter's going to turn out to be, right? And I've talked to my therapist about the fears I have about the certain things that I've put so much into not working out and all that sort of thing. Right. And there is a healthy kind of resignation, right? Mm-hmm. I just find that the Stoics' notion of resignation almost strikes me as a kind of joyful resignation, right? It's just sort of like, Massimo is actually referred to his own daughter as a preferred indifferent.
Right.
Now, I find that just impossible to conceive, right? Yeah. I understand if my daughter dies, right? God forbid, or my daughter turns out to be an arch criminal, right? Mm-hmm. I do understand that at some point, in order to put my life back together, I have to have a healthy resignation, right?
Right.
I have to some way be able to go on. But to suggest that, if that happens, I should be entirely satisfied that my life was worth living, despite the fact that I failed at the main task, right?
Right.
Strikes me as just delusional, right? I mean, that's just not something I can accept. And so I guess I do want to push it back against the notion, not that one should be capable of a certain kind of healthy resignation in the eye of failure, right. In the face of failure. What I want to push back against is the idea that one should be rightly satisfied when one has failed at the majority of one's primary ends, right?
And so, Dan, I was just one
point.
point.
Sorry,
I went on too long about that. I was trying to be as clear as I could.
No. Definitely valid points. I mean, I think that everything you say makes a lot of sense. But I don't want to say but, because that kind of devalues what you said. And I definitely think that all of these are really important. My thinking is that I wonder if, and obviously from your perspective, do you think that it could be that it's an issue with sort of our kind of, as human beings, our innate difficulty with tolerating kind of ambiguity or sort of paradox? Because from my perspective with Stoicism, I think of it as we're just trying to see it in terms of the sort of not necessarily the conflict, but the dichotomy that exists internally. And so what I mean by that is that, like, to give you an example, let's say just the other day there was somebody who I asked out and I was rejected by this person. So I really liked this girl and I asked her out and I was like, man, I kind of put in so much effort into it. And so that was an obvious failure, unquestionably.
Right.
And so there was a part of me that was obviously disappointed and dissatisfied and even hurt by it. But then on the other hand, there was also a part of me that was proud of myself for even putting myself out there. And so those two feelings, which obviously seem and are paradoxical, not contradictory, but they existed in me together, that I was obviously dissatisfied. And if you were to ask me, like, what would I have done differently the next time, I probably would have said I wouldn't have asked her out. Maybe. So, but my thinking is that, like, I think the two can coexist together, where you can on the one hand feel proud of yourself, but then on the other hand be disappointed with the outcome. What do you think?
Look, I agree with all of that, but again, what you're talking about is how I feel about it.
Right.
What I'm asking is, but did you actually flourish? In other words,
no. So the answer would be no, right?
If you reject the idea of objective flourishing, then there's no dispute, right? My dispute is and I do think. I mean, look, let's tweak your example a little bit, because I'm not sure that the example you gave, the stakes are big enough, right? So let me change the example. You asked the girl out. After years of courtship, you got married. You had a 25-year marriage and raised 3 children.
Right.
And the end result of it was a terrible, bitter divorce, children with various serious psychological problems, and so on and so forth. Would you be willing to say, well, I did my best, right? And I'm nonetheless satisfied with my life because the main thing, despite the fact that the main thing I set myself to, and think the most important thing I've ever done, which is raise children, I failed at. Nonetheless, it was my best effort, and so I'm satisfied. I find that a very odd attitude, and I guess a part of me doesn't even really believe anybody really believes it. I think that it's the sort of thing you tell yourself.
Yeah.
You know, I don't want to minimize Massimo's deprivations, whatever they may have been, and right now he's going through a terrible nightmare because he's got a lot of family in Italy.
Yeah.
I can't even imagine the terror the man is suffering right now. But my mother spent her middle school years in a German concentration camp, right?
Mm-hmm.
Most of her family was gassed. That legacy stalked our family for generations. It led to mental illness. It led to suicides. It led to my mother's lifelong depression. I don't know that my mother ever has really been happy. Now, if that doesn't constitute some sort of very profound, deep, objective failure, then I don't know how to even make sense of what's tragic about it, right?
Mm-hmm.
What's tragic is that that the capacity to flourish was ripped away from an entire group of people,
Right.
and to simply say, "Oh no, their lives were worth living
Yeah.
in Auschwitz," right? Because they were good people.
Yeah.
I think is facile. Honestly. Now, I understand that it's meant in a non-facile way,
Right.
and I don't deny that Massimo could describe it in ways that sound very rich, enriching, and deep and meaningful. But again, I guess maybe more than Massimo, I am very, very, very aware and concerned about self-deception.
Yeah.
I don't want to live with illusions, and I don't want to be comforted by illusions. Right.
Well, out of curiosity, is in that case, is human flourishing something that is determined in the moment? And why I put it that way is because technically, if you used these forms of like tactical or consolation as a tactic, right? It could be that in resigning to whatever situation that you're in, or whatever feelings that you feel, or whatever. However events have gone, maybe that can lead you to then take another sort of action that could then sort of lead to flourishing.
I agree. That's why I said I think Stoicism, if you asked me my opinion of it, I would say I think its chief value is as a discipline for consolation and productive resignation, right? Which is how I would the terms I would use to characterize what you just said, right? Mm-hmm. In other words, the Stoic attitude is deeply wise in the confrontation of failure, right, and catastrophe. That's why I think it's not an accident. I wrote this in the dueling essays I did with Massimo. It's not an accident if you look at the period from which Stoicism emerges.
Right.
It's not the high periods of classical civilizations, it's the declining periods of classical civilization, right? Yeah. It's not an accident that it's so influential on Christianity and that there's so much crossover between Stoicism and Christianity, right? I mean, Christianity takes it even further. They're convinced that the world is going to end imminently, right? And so the whole thing is about a certain kind of a productive, deep consolation and resignation, in the adding with the hope of an afterlife. But we don't live in that kind of civilization, and so I just don't think in our civilization, I think it makes more sense as a discipline for productive consolation and for consolation and productive resignation. I don't think it really makes sense as a philosophy of eudaimonia. Mm-hmm. I have other problems with it, with Stoicism. I don't know why this is turning into an argument about Stoicism, but I guess it's not a bad foil. Right. It's not a bad way to define Aristotelianism, to contrast it with its closest cousin, right, because clearly they are the two closest of the Eudaimonist philosophies. I mean, you also have Stoicism's relationship to cynicism. That's its brother on the other side, right? Mm-hmm. And Stoicism, some people would say, is sort of between cynicism and Aristotelianism. Mm-hmm. But the other problem I have with Stoicism, I think, is it overemphasizes the ethical. Mm-hmm.
And how would Aristotle?
Massimo's much more interested in the ethical than I am.
Well, how was it then, according to Aristotle? How did he define ethics? Because I remember reading that from kind of your and his perspective, that he wasn't so much about or so obsessed with rule making, as he was about sort of conceptualizing it in a kind of in the framework of sort of a guide for a person's life, rather than particular sets of rules to live by.
Yeah, well, look, neither the Stoics nor the Aristotelians are going to have rules in the modern sense of a moral rule that you would get like out of Kant or out of utilitarianism, right? And that's because the conception of virtue that the ancient Greeks are working with, first of all, is applied directly only to character and only indirectly to conduct, and secondly, because it assumes, correctly in my view, that the question of virtue with respect to conduct is going to be highly contextually sensitive, right? And we can talk about that if you want to. In my view, the difference between Aristotle and the Stoic isn't so much their conception of virtue, but rather the relative place of virtue in the overall picture of human flourishing. For Aristotle, moral goodness is only one dimension of human flourishing. And not necessarily an overriding one, right? Whereas as a matter of fact, one could argue that Aristotle thought the highest form of flourishing involved no ethical virtue at all, right? And that's the life of contemplation, which we can talk about if you want. Massimo disagrees with me on this, but I think I have the bulk of Aristotle's scholars on my side on this. So for one thing, I think that the relative place of morality is different, right? So for Aristotle, moral goodness is one element of human flourishing. For the Stoics, moral goodness is the whole of a life worth living, and all the rest of the stuff are preferred indifference, right?
So why did Aristotle consider contemplation like his highest value?
Because he thought it was the life of the gods. And this is getting into a bit of technicality. In Aristotle, in the Nicomachean Ethics, you basically have two books. Books 1 through 9 is all about the life of moral virtue. Book 10 is about the life of contemplation. And the life of contemplation is a life devoted entirely to scholarship. It's a life in which we exercise the theoretical sort of reason rather than the practical, right? And if you think about it, in a certain way, all that this type of thinking requires is a person and the truth, right? It's a person trying to wrestle with the truth, right? That does not involve any activity per se, and thus is not subject to deliberative reason, and thus cannot be a form of moral flourishing, moral goodness by definition, right? Because for Aristotle, moral goodness always involves activity and deliberating over our activity.
Right.
It's moral life is lived in the polis, right? It's lived in the social framework. It's not a private internal value, and that's why there's the Stoicism. The Stoics were so amenable to Christianity, because Christianity internalizes virtue and goodness, has to, because the world is fallen, right? No goodness can happen in the world, right? So they take the Stoic sort of pessimism and turn it into a full blown the world is shit and nothing good can happen in it, and so we now retreat to the interior, right? For Aristotle, ethical life is always lived in the polis. There is no such thing as private, internal morality, right? Character is displayed in one's dispositions to act, right? And so the life of contemplation does not involve activity in the polis, and so by definition, it's not a moral life, right? And he even says in Book 10 that it's the life of the gods because the gods are pure thought. They're not embodied, right? And he even says at a certain point it would be absurd to ascribe virtues to gods, right? To ascribe the virtue of thrift to a god would mean that a god spends money, right? Which is ridiculous, right? And so by definition, he says the contemplative life is a human being living like a god, thinking rather than doing, and therefore it's not a moral life, but even a higher form of life. It's a life that some human beings are capable of living, but it's not a human life. It's a life of a god, right? Now, that's just the life of contemplation that has a sort of a hard demarcation from the life of virtue for Aristotle. But I would also go further, and this may be more of a neo-Aristotelianism rather than true to the historical Aristotle, but this is the view I presented in the book is a neo-Aristotelianism. It's my digestion of Aristotle in a modern framework. I would include all of the other forms of deliberative but non-social political activities as also part of flourishing and as non-ethical. So I'm talking about artistic, creative in other ways, right? So artists, craftsmen, sportsmen, so on and so forth. These are all distinctive ways of flourishing, human ways of flourishing that are also not ethical.
Right.
And in my view, a fully flourishing life has to involve a mixture, right? I've written a lot about and talked a lot about what I take to be an overabundance of morality, by which I mean an over focus on morality. Here I'm very much in support of and supported by a very famous essay by Susan Wolf.
Yeah, Moral Saints.
Right, called Moral Saints. In my view, what the Stoic essentially says is that everyone should aspire to be a moral saint. And in my view, I can't think of anything worse than living in a society full of moral saints.
If you want, I could read the quote from her, actually. So she says, the ideal of a life of moral sainthood disturbs not simply because it is an ideal of a life in which morality unduly dominates. The normal person's direct and specific desires for objects, activities, and events that conflict with the attainment of moral perfection are not simply sacrificed, but removed, suppressed, or subsumed. The way in which morality is apt to dominate is particularly disturbing, for it seems to require either the lack or the denial of the existence of an identifiable personal self.
Yeah. So, I mean, to my mind, the way I look at this and is that to focus only on moral virtue and to say that the life worth living is the life of moral virtue, which is what the Stoics say, to my mind, means that we should then all aspire to be moral saints, right? Because everything else is a preferred indifferent, right? But I don't think that these other things are preferred indifference. A life in which everybody was only moral, and in which there was no great cuisine, no great arts, no great athletics, no great video games, no great anything, is a life I wouldn't want to live for 5 minutes, right? I mean, to my mind, morality is always in the service of the good life. It doesn't constitute the good life. To me, ethics is ultimately an instrumental good, right? For Massimo and for the Stoics, it's an intrinsic good, right? It's the thing. To me, morality is sort of the deeper, more profound version of manners, right? I mean, it has to do with how you behave, and the point of it is so that we can all get to the things that we really want to do, right? And I find that not only do I think that just in terms of how I think about my own life, it also I think that in terms of the kinds of people I like to be around. I really don't like people who are morally obsessive, right? I mean, I don't, it's very hard for me. I have a few relationships that are not like this, but I can think of one ethical vegan I have really good friendship with, right? And it's precisely the one who is able to bracket it and has something else to offer. So that when I'm hanging out with her, it's my department head. But I find moral obsessives to be very unappealing people to be around.
Yeah, because a lot of times they're self-righteous, and sometimes
or just not fun.
they've got nothing else going, man.
Mm-hmm.
It's like,
That's
okay, great, you're a great person. Now, can we do something, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And then you find out, well, you can't do anything because all of those things fall under the various moral prohibitions that this person's concerned with. You know, one of the ways I put this in the chapter is, I don't believe that moral considerations are always overriding, and I think Aristotle is one way of articulating that, right? Of expressing that idea, in this idea that a flourishing life is one of mixed excellences. Yes, some moral excellences, certainly, but other kinds of excellences too. Aristotle is constantly emphasizing the importance of balance.
Right.
He makes a direct relationship between sort of one's well-being as a person and one's physical well-being, right? Too much exercise, bad for you. Too little exercise, good for you, right? The right amount of exercise is what, I'm sorry, too little exercise, bad for you. Too much exercise, bad for you.
Right.
The moderate amount, good for you. This generalizes in terms of physical well-being, but I would also argue that it generalizes to, and this is not a word, characterological well-being, right? A person shouldn't be a one-note Charlie. And I find Stoicism a bit of a one-note Charlie, right?
Yeah. And what's so difficult with morality is, especially if we're taking into consideration or just taking on Aristotle's conception of it, is that it's pretty contextual. So it's very hard for us to decide what that golden mean is in every single situation.
That's right. And you can't. And there's no, that's the other thing, is that Aristotle recognizes that philosophy, by which let's mean, you know, certain kinds of rational inquiry, can only get you so close to the target, after which it all comes down to judgment and ultimately even perception. Right?
How so? What does that mean?
So, I'm trying to think how to say this in a way that's clear and doesn't require technical expertise. Reason is an instrument that operates within the general, right? Because reason always generalizes, and reason depends upon generalizable rules, right? I would say that most of human life operates at the level of the particular, not the general. Okay. And with regard to the particular, reason can tell us very little, right? So now let me illustrate this with respect to Aristotle, all right? Reason can tell me that excess and deficiency are bad and that moderation is good, right? Reason can tell me that.
Right.
And he does say that. But what reason can't tell me is what on a specific particular instance constitutes moderation, excess, and deficiency.
Right.
Reason can't tell me that. That's going to depend on the circumstances. The very same thing may be excessive in one set of circumstances, deficient in another, and moderate in a third. Now, how then do you figure out, beyond that level of generality, moderate, not excessive or deficient, how do you get down to, okay, today, Tuesday, in the room here with these people right now, what to do requires a kind of perception, right? To see it, right? That which cannot be said can only be shown, right? That's a line from Wittgenstein, who I'm also a huge fan of. If you ever want to do a podcast on Wittgenstein, I can talk about him for hours.
Very cool.
That which cannot be said, i.e. reasoned about and thus spoken of in a general way, can only be shown, pointed at, right? He gives an analogy of a baker, right? Right? I can give you the instruction that says the bread should not be baked too much or too little, but the right amount. But I can only see if it's baked the right amount. I can't deduce whether it's baked the right amount, right? And so for Aristotle, philosophy can only offer a relatively limited amount of guidance in the pursuit of a life, because most of life operates at the level of the particular. This is another objection I have to the Stoics. They, in my view, wildly overestimate how much good a philosophy can do you in the particulars of your life. And that's why if you read the chapter, which I know you did, you'll see that I said, you know, I worry that I may have disappointed my readers because my readers are expecting rules and practices, and here, do this 5 times a day, and wake up in the morning and stare off and think about this and that. And you know what? That might be great on Tuesday, might be the worst thing you could ever do on Thursday, right? And so I know now I'm starting to sound like a Jew.
No, this is great. This is great. This is like clip material.
Right? But you know what I'm saying? In other words, what I like about, listen, my original idea for the book was to write a skeptical chapter. I didn't even want to do Aristotle. I told Aristotle, I want to write an anti-philosophy chapter. I want to say I'm against philosophies of life, right? For the reasons that we're talking about right now, right? And Massimo was like, yeah, but that's not really going to work. You know, he didn't mind it intellectually, but in this concept of a popular book, in an academic book, maybe. In a popular book. So what he asked me to do instead was, and Massimo really was the ringleader of this. He deserves the credit for the book even existing. It wouldn't have happened had his How to Be a Stoic not been a huge success, which it was. And if you haven't talked to him about that book, you should.
He'll be on at the end of next month.
It's really good. Well, if you want to show him this before he...
I'm sure he'll watch it.
But so instead of writing an anti-philosophy of life chapter, which is what I really wanted to do and would have also suited my temperament because you can see the sort of person I am, I wanted to be the asshole in the book, right? But instead he says, why don't you try to figure out what philosophy best approximates your attitude, right? And it's always been Aristotelianism. I didn't have to figure it out. I've always told people if they ask me, well, which philosophy, most best suits you? And I say Aristotle, no question about it. But part of the reason it suits me is that it's very minimalistic. Aristotle, at the beginning of the Nicomachean Ethics, before he even starts, basically tells you, don't expect too much out of this.
That's really cool.
It's not going to tell you how to live. At best, it's going to give you a sketch of what a good life looks like, right? Really a sketch, like a stick drawing, right? But beyond that, the only way is to do. That's why it's all about good habits, right? It's all about and those are only acquired through doing. They're not acquired by ratiocinating prior to doing, right? I don't want to say Aristotle is a behaviorist, but there are even behaviorist elements in Aristotle.
Right, I was actually thinking that he seems to have been one of the early, literally psychotherapists.
And I'm a fan of behaviorism. I mean, it's as a complete theory, of course, it's false. I don't deny that there's a mind or that there are mental states.
Well, that's what's cognitive behavioral now.
But in a lot of ways, it's correct. I think we wildly overemphasize either the prominence or the efficacy of ratiocination, and especially prior to action. I just don't think it works like that. And Aristotle really provides a way to understand why, right? Reason only can get you so much down the ladder from generality to particularity, after which you're in the realm of particularity and reason is almost entirely useless, right? It's all about sensitivities and being able to see things and being able to hear a certain way, and just having a sort of being habituated to subtleties and differences in certain circumstances. And notice that's also something that can only come with age. Aristotle says there can be no young, wise people, right? And he's right. You can have a genius young person, but you can't have a wise young person, right? I mean, why? Because it's not a matter of reasoning. It's a matter of experience.
Interesting. So what you're saying is that you could pretty much understand the theory even in its complex depth, but you don't really know how to apply it until you get the necessary
Isn't
experience.
That true?
Right.
Isn't that true?
Yeah.
I mean, listen, you could read all the instructions and know exactly what you have to do to ride a bicycle, and you still couldn't ride it, right?
Yeah.
And I said, what I would say living is a lot more like riding a bicycle. And the relative value of philosophy to that kind of activity is relatively small. There's the philosopher I'm a big fan of, 20th century, name was Gilbert Ryle, has a famous distinction he makes between knowing how and knowing that, where knowing that is sort of the possession of information, and knowing how is the possession of a competency, right? And most people think that in order to know how, you first have to know that. And what he points out is that no, actually, most of the time, knowing how has nothing to do with knowing that. It's just a matter of practice, right? Of doing something over and over again. Indeed, knowing that is itself a kind of practice that you can do well or poorly, right? And so he actually argues that knowing how is prior to knowing that. But I would say that living is 80% knowing how and only 20% knowing that. And so the relative usefulness of a philosophy is relatively meager. And that's why I often come off as very anti-philosophical when we talk about these issues, because I just don't think philosophy has that much to tell us about how to lead our lives in a way that's that Aristotle would conceive of as, and I would conceive of as worthy of having made the effort.
And I love that because, like, as an existential therapist, I go through this with clients all the time, where they kind of come to me wanting a precise blueprint of the exact decisions they're supposed to make.
They want you to tell them what to do.
Yeah. But
I'm not you. It's
right.
It's not going to translate, right?
And so what I pretty much help them, or try to help them do, is help them kind of establish that establish the belief that there's a groundlessness, that there is no blueprint. And the most that I could do is give them a kind of framework in terms of helping them figure out what their values are. Right. But at the end of the day, we're going to have to come up with it together. But they're going to be the ultimate deciders of what values they have and how do they kind of manifest them.
What's fascinating is your argument against philosophy is also it's kind of like an argument against self-help too. Actually, right, all those self-help books that
I dislike, one of the things that I was worried about here, and that I was made very clear from early on, is that I want no part of the self-help industry. Fortunately, Massimo feels the same way. I don't believe that even his book, How to Be a Stoic, or even the manual for Stoics that he published, is rightfully put in that genre. But I was worried that because we were going with a trade press and not an academic press, not writing an academic book, that we would wind up in self-help sections in bookstores and stuff next to, Deepak Chopra and Tony Robbins and other sort of cringy stuff like that. And I just I want nothing to do with it. Precisely because I think they fundamentally misunderstand what human life is like. I mean, human life is not routinizable in that way, right? I mean, it just isn't. The 10 things that may work for you may be the worst possible things for me to do, just because of the differences in our temperaments and circumstances. What's generally true of all of us, don't do too much, don't do too little, do the right amount, is true, but is not very useful advice, right? I mean, if you think about it, how much does that actually help you tomorrow when you're standing in the store and you're trying to figure out how you should act when this ass in front of you has 10,000 coupons, right?
10,000 toilet paper.
Yeah, the toilet paper rolls.
We tried to go to the store. We went to the store a few days ago.
Yeah.
I was sort of shocked looking at the, I don't get the toilet paper thing. I just don't get it. I mean, don't you have a shower that has a hand nozzle?
Just jump in the shower. I don't get that either. It doesn't make any sense. Why spend all that money, especially if you're home?
I mean, if it really got to that,
right?
I mean,
and so Dan, I really liked your example when you mentioned drinking excessively and obviously drinking in moderation. The one that you mentioned in the book. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah. So I mean, people I think a lot of times think that and now we're talking about moral virtue, so let's sort of focus on that, right? Because Aristotle does have a view on that. I think people often think of moral virtue in a way that's more consistent with the sort of the Christian way of thinking about it, and that is that it involves absolutes, right? It involves either always doing something or never doing something, right? We even have a weird, the word temperance, if you take its meaning in sort of like the context of American English, right? It actually means never drinking, right? Which is interesting if you look at the literal meaning of the word, right? How could it be that and that's because I think there's this very deep-seated Christianity that's almost a kind of a racial memory that just sort of I'm not even Christian, I'm Jewish, and I even noticed it in certain sort of ways I think about things, right? It's so embedded in our civilization for good reason. But actually, if you think about it, for every vice of excess, there's also a vice of deficiency, and vice versa, right? I mean, no matter what it is, You may have to think of a pretty radical context, right? But nothing is inherently excessive or deficient or moderate, right? I mean, and so, the person who drinks, too much is obviously that's a vice, right? It's a form of gluttony, right? But there's also such a thing as drinking too little, right? In this, we do have names for that vice, but they're just not as common, right? So we do sometimes talk about people as being insensible, right? Or boorish,
or
right?
prudish.
Or prudish, exactly. And those all get at that sort of sense that there is a kind of a corresponding vice of deficiency. I gave the example of this party I threw for my 50th birthday, where I spent, a ridiculous sum of money on food and libations, right, for people. And I could see, herds of all different sort of types of moral outrage types criticizing it for being excessive, right? How could you spend that kind of money when there's people starving in the world? How could you eat meat? How can you and all that, right? And what I tried to say was, I said, look, if I did this every week, of course that would be apt, right?
Yeah.
If I threw a party like this every week, where we're spending $3,000, a week on booze and food for all my friends, right? That would be rightly criticized as excessive. I said, but if I never ever did anything like this, ever, I think I'd be, a freaking bore, right? I mean, I wouldn't want to be that guy, and I wouldn't want to be friends with that guy, right? So I thought that was sort of a real illustration, right? There are times where even what you might normally think of as excessive, if you think of the right frame of reference, is not excessive at all. Actually, that's what you should do, right? That's the kind of person we admire. What a great guy, man! He threw this great party. He paid for all of us. He treated us. I felt like $1 million. I walked in. I had a custom menu made, right? That's something I think you should be praised for, right? In the right circumstances, right? Twice in a lifetime, you do something like this, right? A 50th birthday, or a wedding party, or these sorts of things where what in other contexts would be excessive, in my view, in these contexts, is not only non-excessive but actually admirable, right? Is what you would hope people would do, because it exhibits sort of the appropriate. It exhibits the appropriate joie de vivre for a healthy person, a mentally healthy person, and also indicates is an expression of love for one's friends and family, right?
And life.
And for life itself, an appreciation for life itself, and so. But I think that a lot of people think of virtue as sort of, constant abstinence and, bean sprout eating and never having any luxuries and, tiny houses and all this sort of stuff. And I find such people just very strange and not people I really want to spend very much time with, because they're just not, I guess it's not a surprise to me that they're not the sort of people that most people tend to want to spend a lot of time with, right? They tend to operate in very tight cliques because most of the rest of the people find them to be tedious and uninspiring and generally downers and
or rigid. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, I guess I want to, 3 cheers for appropriate excess, it seems.
I love that. I love that. And so there was a question that I had about the chapter you had in the book. So you said somewhere in it that you can only really understand or know if a person lived a flourishing life pretty much at the time of their death or pretty much after it. How come that's...
Aristotle says this.
Right, how come?
And I think Aristotle actually, if you take the logic of it seriously, you really can never know.
Right.
There's always going to be uncertainty. But again, notice that's an epistemic problem, right? Because look, I can do everything right, things, the endeavors I engage in, the projects I put in motion can all come to fruition.
Mm-hmm.
But there could be deep-seated flaws, or there could be elements of the situation,
Mm-hmm.
or characteristics of the people that follow me that destroy all of it, right? So Aristotle says, we really can't tell whether a person has flourished until after they've lived and we see how everything turned out,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know whether, now we'll go back to what we talked about prior to recording that you'll get, but you won't,
Mm-hmm.
I don't know whether, I succeeded, in my Fallout New Vegas playthrough until I see the slideshow at the end and I see how everything turned out for everybody, right?
Makes sense.
I know I tried to help these people, but what actually happened to them, right? That does sort of matter, and I don't find that out until the end, right? And up until then, it's just all promissory notes, right? And now, I don't think this is the sort of thing that's properly understood in terms of, well, how long after, 5 years after or 10 years after? It's more the issue that there's always going to be uncertainty as to whether one has flourished. And that is paying respect to the element of your flourishing that is not controlled by you. One of the main problems, again, I'm sorry to keep bringing this back to Stoicism, but I think it's such a useful contrast. Massimo, the Stoics think that flourishing is self-sufficient. I don't.
Mm-hmm.
I think that our flourishing is dependent on things that we don't control. Exactly on those preferred indifference that the Stoic carves off and says, nope, conveniently enough, whether my life was worth living doesn't have anything to do with these things I don't control. Now, to me, that's a little too convenient.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And does sound a little bit, I don't know about that, right? I mean, to me, it matters how things turned out, but you really only know how things turned out in the end, and even then, you don't really know. And so, to never be too certain strikes me as paying healthy respect to the aspect of life that's not in our control. One of the things that the Greeks were very sort of, I think, healthily aware of that today is sort of abhorrent to us is the extent to which our successes or failures are in part due to luck.
Mm-hmm.
Today, we view that we have such a sort of perverse notion of fairness that we refuse to acknowledge the role of luck, the role that luck plays in life, or we try to theorize it away or rationalize it away, and I don't think it can. I mean, I think it's important to be respectful of that. Partly, if you think about it, being respectful of that is part of what is necessary to maintain a healthy humility.
Yeah.
Right. If you don't think anything's due to luck and everything's under your control, and dichotomy of control, I put all those things out there and everything else is in here. I don't know where your humility comes from then, because all the stuff you don't have control over, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter, right? It's only if it matters that one then becomes rightly humble, right? I'm humbled by the fact that I may fail despite my best efforts.
Right.
If I can't fail, I don't understand what my humility could consist of, right?
Yeah.
And I do think that's important, humility.
Yeah, and what it means to truly succeed, right? If there was no failure or perceived failure.
Right. You can't fail to try to hit the target.
But then how much can you really enjoy your success if there are all these other external variables?
Oh, I think you enjoy them all the more because you realize that they're fleeting. That you may think you have them and they may get snatched away. In my view, actually, the Aristotelian has a healthier appreciation for the preciousness of the good of the preferred indifference, precisely because they matter. Right? They don't matter. Right? What does the Stoics aim for? Attitude, equanimity.
Right.
That means it doesn't matter. Right?
I mean, definitely.
I don't know how you can have humility and equanimity at the same time. I don't get it. Right.
Yeah. I mean, that was definitely not my interpretation. I don't think that it's not so much that it doesn't matter, but it's that it matters less than the person's character. So.
Like I said,
yeah.
I don't know. Because to me it's kind of slippery. I don't know whether I'm necessarily disagreeing with it or whether we're just carving up the categories differently.
I think so. That's kind of how I interpret it. I think both of your philosophies make sense.
The only place where I see it seems to me a very clear conflict is this issue of was my life worth living in terms of whether I should be satisfied.
Right.
And I just do have a problem with the idea that I should be satisfied when everything I've tried to do has been a failure.
Yeah.
I don't see why I should be satisfied with that.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yeah.
It implies that I wasn't actually trying to succeed. Right.
Mm-hmm. Well, then I would say if that's the case, if you weren't then trying to succeed, then yeah, you're right. You would actually be right there. So what did you have you ever read Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning?
Sure.
What did you think?
Listen, I've read a lot of that literature, right? I mean, but I think it's worth reflecting upon the frame of reference in which that literature is produced, right? Primo Levi, Survival in Auschwitz. I mean, all these things. These are in a sense musings, contemplations that come out of lives lived in extremis, right? Right. Now, I think that it's important to have a body of thought that applies to life in extremis. Mm-hmm. But I don't think that a philosophy of life should be shaped by a philosophy aimed at life in extremis, because for us and most of us in the developed world, life is not an extremis. And even in the places where it is, the aim is to get out of the life in extremis, right? I mean, part of the point I always make is all these people in developing countries about whom we rightfully have tremendous ethical concern, their aim isn't to remain perfect, permanent objects of ethical concern. Their aim is to no longer be objects of ethical concern, right? Is to, in a sense, get to, in other words, the preferred indifference are the reason for doing the whole damn thing, right? I mean, yes, if you can't have them, if you're living in extremis, if you're living in the middle of Darfur or a civil war or whatever, okay, we hunker down and we console ourselves. Yes, ultimately what counts is that I'm a good person and da-da-da. But isn't the aim ultimately to not be in that situation?
Yeah. And is your fear that Stoicism leads to complacency?
My fear is that Stoicism, if taken as a philosophy of life, rather than as a discipline for consolation and productive resignation, doesn't have any way to explain why it is that our main aim would be to cease being, right? Right? In that position, right? I mean, the whole reason why we're worried about, why we care about and want to do things for poor people is so that they'll eventually become unpoor, right? How can that be a preferred indifferent?
And what is productive resignation?
When you are defeated, to be able to experience the tragic without it becoming paralyzing.
Gotcha.
Without it undermining the capacity to overcome the tragic, right? Yeah. And that's where I think Stoicism is really valuable, because I think done properly articulated, what it's basically telling you is to exercise, to put things in a kind of proportion, right? And to live to fight another day and all that. But if at the end of the day, that is not the aim, then I don't understand the point of it. To my mind, not only are the preferred indifference, not indifference, they're the point of the whole damn thing. They're why everybody's trying so hard not to be poor, right? Yeah. They're not trying hard not to be poor so that they can have wonderful character. They're trying hard not to be poor so that they can enjoy the preferred indifference. Now, that doesn't sound to me like it's indifferent.
Yeah.
Right? And if you ask me, why do I actually give a shit about anybody having good character? It's worth asking, why is it so valuable to have good character? Now, in Christianity, I understand the answer, because that's the source of your salvation, right? But if you take that narrative out of it, what reason is there to give a shit about good character other than that people behave well enough so that I can get on with pursuing my preferred indifference? Right.
Well, I'm assuming the Stoics would say because it's the end in itself, that it's a way for you to sort, or maybe a means to an end if it's a way for you to.
That's the stipulative. I mean, that doesn't tell. I mean, and I don't know that I think it's really true to people's experience, right? Yeah. Again, go talk to people in Darfur and ask them what they're trying to get, and their answer is not going to be good character, right? Yeah, their answer is going to be food, a day without people shooting at me, or trying to enslave my children or whatever, right? It's not going to be, virtue. Right. And I don't think that's indifferent. I think that's the whole point. Yeah. So I would subordinate virtue. I would say virtue is a means.
Yeah.
It's not the end. Massimo thinks it's the end. I understand the view.
Right.
I just can't share it, and I just see too much that seems to contradict it around me. So
yeah, well, I mean, in my conception, I think that both philosophies work hand in hand really well, and I agree with you, and I agree with the Stoic view as well. And so, Dan, I mean, this show was super insightful, man. Thank you so much for coming on.
Well, it was a pleasure, and you guys do a nice job of it. You're very amenable, and if you ever want to talk to me about anything else, I'm always available. And yeah, it was great.
Absolutely.
And if we wanted to follow your work, where could we find it?
So I don't know if you publish links with your so I edit and publish a magazine online called the Electric Agora. We have a stable of writers. I'm also one of the writers, and also we do publish some one-offs that people send things to me, and I would say it's a broad collection of things in philosophy, popular culture, politics. The most recent essay we just published was actually an essay from one of our regulars about the 1960s Batman, from a semiotic point of view, signs and symbols. So really eclectic. So they can follow my work there. I also host the Sophia program on Meaning of Life TV, which is a sister site of bloggingheads.tv, which is a major public affairs website run by Robert Wright, who is a multiple New York Times bestselling author, former editor at the Atlantic Monthly, New Republic. He's part of that New Republic gang that goes back to like the 80s. Mickey Kaus, Robert Wright, and a bunch of others.
Robert Wright?
Right.
Right, okay.
Wright.
Gotcha.
He's written books that you guys are right up your alley. I don't know if he published a book a few years ago called Why Buddhism is True. He has a book called The Evolution of God. He's right in your sweet spot of stuff you're interested in.
Oh, cool.
So I would see if he wants to talk. He always wants to talk about these sorts of things. He created the Meaning of Life.tv channel as an offshoot to Blogging Heads because he was as interested in those sorts of things as he was in the public affairs stuff that he was already doing. So I have a show there that Massimo actually and I developed together, and for a while it was just us doing dialogues. But then eventually Massimo got really busy. He became more of a public intellectual on his own right. He started doing the Stoicism stuff, so it sort of became my show. He now appears less frequently, and I have a lot of other people that I talk to. So people can also follow my work there too, and I'll give you links email you links to all of this. So,
cool. And where can we find you on social media?
The Electric Agora has a Twitter feed in which I often intemperately hold forth, which I will send to you.
Okay, cool.
And we also have Electric Agora has a Facebook page, but I only use it to announce new essays. I don't really engage on it myself. So if people want to engage in me in the social universe sphere, it would be Twitter. Okay. The virtues of which I'm still not sure of. I mean, there are times where I hate myself for even participating in it, and then there's other times where I think, okay, I can see why this is important to do.
Yeah,
understandably. Yeah.
I vacillate back and forth.
Well, thanks again, man. This was such an insightful show.
Appreciate it.
All right, Dan. Take care, man.
Thank you.
Be healthy.
All right, guys. Wow, that was an awesome episode.
Yeah, that was really fun.
Yeah.
Oh, man.
So if you want to follow us at Seize the Moment Podcast on Facebook and Instagram, and at Seize_podcast on Twitter. Subscribe, hit the bell.
And you can also find us at the O4L Online Network under the show section on Seize the Moment Podcast.
And see you guys next week for episode 45. Be healthy.